Chapter 36. They were still alive. Grant had no idea what would happen next, but for now, they were still alive. A little worse for the wear, as Summer's swollen eye and the blood on her jacket attested to. He'd almost asked Ramon why he hadn't killed him when he'd had the chance, but he didn't want to give the guy any ideas. Although, if Ramon had counted all the men Grant had killed or incapacitated when he rescued Misty, he should have known he had no choice. Because Grant would do what he had to do, kill whom he had to kill, to save Summer and Brian. Grant had led them both into danger and then left them to manage alone. This was what happened. He should never have allowed them to be part of this operation. He should have hired mercenaries. Would have if any had been available. He should have left Brian in Brunswick and shipped Summer somewhere far away until Ramon was out of the picture. Bad things always happened when Grant left people alone in dangerous situations. Except, he wasn't their last line of defense. As much as he loved them, God was their protector, and he was a lot better at it than Grant would ever be. That had to be why they'd made it this far. Wasn't that what Brian had been trying to tell him? That the fall hadn't been his fault? That God had been there, had kept him alive, had kept him from being more injured? That God had used it for good? Grant was trying to believe that he would show up, but it wasn't easy. "We need your help." The bright yellow bag was lying on top of the messy bed across from them, just a couple of feet away. But the goon was watching. Summer was cuddled up beside him. As much as he hated to move, he had to be ready. He stuck his elbow out, hoping Bruno didn't see. She sat up and let go of his hand. "It's getting warm. Can you scoot down?" Wow, she was good. Knew exactly what they needed. "Sure." He put distance between them. Summer shifted away from Brian a little, because they'd all need room to maneuver, assuming they would get the opportunity to fight. "Hey!" Bruno's arm had slipped a little, but now he raised the weapon and aimed it at Grant's head. "Don't move!" Grant lifted his hands, all surrender and supplication. "Just trying to get comfortable." He switched to Spanish. "You're not our enemy." Bruno acted as if he hadn't heard. "To be honest," Grant said, still in the man's native tongue, "your real enemy here is Ramon. He's using you to save himself. He is my friend." Sure, but how many years did you spend in prison for him? How many of his so-called friends will land there today? How many men did he leave on shore?" Bruno's eyes narrowed the slightest bit. "The authorities were there. You saw that, right? Your friends are all going to prison. If they're not dead, that is. That's your fault, not Ramon's." "Ramon knew we'd be there," Grant said. "He knew, yet he risked all those men anyway. Not to mention your payoff. I assume you were going to make a cut. The drugs are in the hands of authorities now. Ramon always pays us. Enough to kill innocent people? What's the going rate for murder? You ask me this? Where is my friend? Where is Juan? Which one is he?" "On the dinghy, now probably at the bottom of the sea." Grant shook his head. "I prefer not to kill people. Last I saw him, he was floating away. Unconscious but alive. How long he'll stay that way?" Grant lifted his shoulders and let them drop. "That's up to God. Maybe you should say a prayer for him." Bruno flinched. Was prayer a sore spot? Or maybe a soft spot? "The police are coming, you know. The Maine Marine Patrol, the Coast Guard. Everybody's looking for you. Eventually they're going to find you. But if you help us, I will never... I'll tell them what you did, and they'll go easy on you. We can make it look like I overpowered you so Ramon will never know." At that, Bruno grinned. "You? Overpower me? Nobody would believe that." The man was tall and looked strong, no question about it. But Grant was trained. He could take him. But that wasn't how this would go. Grant forced a smile he didn't feel. Worth a try. He deliberately turned his back to the guy, facing his brother in Summer. He spoke low and fast. "There are weapons in the waterproof bag. If something happens to me, fight your way out. If you have to, kill every man on this boat." Fresh tears dripped down Summer's face. "Nothing's going to happen to you. We need you." Grant couldn't let himself be affected by her tears. He shifted his gaze to Brian. "I notified the authorities, but who knows when they'll get here." "Stop talking," a threat hummed in Bruno's voice. Brian held Grant's eye contact a long time, understanding what Grant wanted, what Grant was saying, that he wanted them to stay alive, that he'd give anything, including his own life, to make sure that happened. Grant waited for an argument, even a shaking head, but Brian dipped his chin, face grim. Grant turned forward again, hoping to see contemplation on Bruno's face, some inkling that he was considering what Grant had said. But it had been a long shot, and the thug's face had slipped back into that expressionless mask. He would kill without thinking twice about it. Grant wouldn't lose his life so easily. He closed his eyes, prayed that the God he'd loved for so many years, the one who'd given his glorious life for Grant's unworthy one, would give him the power, the courage, to do what he had to do. Waited for the Lord to show him another way, but no other ideas came. He pulled in a lungful of air and blew it out, turned again to the two people beside him, met Brian's eyes and said very low, "I love you." Brian nodded, his eyes filling. He said nothing. "Stop talking." Bruno's voice was filled with wrath. "You look forward." Grant focused on Summer. "I love you." "I love you too." Those words, those 4 words, made what he was about to do so much harder. Because for an instant, the future they should have had stretched out before him. A wedding, a home, children running and laughing and playing. The future he'd dreamed of for 7 years was so close. Tears pricked his eyes. He didn't bother to hide them, just leaned toward her and kissed her forehead. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I promise to protect you." She leaned back, eyes wide. "Don't. Please." He held her gaze a long time, wishing he could see another way. But the authorities hadn't found them yet. Even if they did, Ramon wouldn't turn them over. He'd use them to ensure the police didn't try to stop him. Escaping punishment seemed to be the man's superpower. When he got away, he'd kill Grant and Brian and sell Summer into a future Grant wouldn't let himself consider. He turned away from her, put his feelings for her behind him, because he had no choice, because looking at Summer was only making what he had to do harder. His heart was racing, his lungs screaming for air as they had beneath the cold water. He braced himself, prepared to move, and just then, the boat lurched. Bruno's gun dipped as his gaze flicked upward toward the cockpit. Grant propelled himself off the bed and into the big man, unsurprised when he heard the gunshot that would steal his life.
Chapter 37. A scream tore from Summer's throat, but Grant had trained her well. As the boat slowed into a turn, she propelled herself off the bed and into the murderer, who'd killed the man she loved. She tackled him, her grip on his gun arm to keep from getting shot. He hit her with his cast, but she kept pummeling him. Who cared that he was stronger than she was? Who cared how much it hurt? He punched her in the side, in the back, muttering a stream of Spanish words she assumed wouldn't be fit for his abuela's ears. She managed to wrench away and put some distance between them, thinking her legs would be more effective than her fists. He reared up as if to tackle her. Then a second gunshot split the silence. She flinched, waiting for the pain, but it didn't come. A hand gripped her shoulder and yanked her back. It's okay, I think he's dead." He killed him. She wanted to attack the man again, but there was blood on his chest. His eyes were open and lifeless. "Not Grant." Brian's words were clipped. "The other guy's dead. Grab that bag. We need another gun." "Where did you get?" "It's the one Grant dropped when he first stepped in." "We need 2 guns." The words, practically grunted out, had her swiveling. Grant was sitting up, bedding pressed to his thigh, his face twisted in pain. It was the most beautiful sight she'd ever seen. Brian crouched beside him. "What should I do?" "The bag, Summer," Grant said. "Quick." She heard footsteps closing in. She grabbed the bag, shoved her hand inside, and pulled out a gun just as a figure stepped into the opening. She fired, hitting the newcomer in the chest. He crumpled, and she tossed the bag behind her, not taking her eyes off the doorway. "Got it," Brian said. "There should be some string in there." She heard scuffling, and then Brian's incredulous voice. "Is this a bikini?" "Straps." Grant's voice was pinched. "And a little fabric. Hurry." She shifted backward, stepping over the dead man, never taking her eyes off the opening. She heard no footsteps, but that only meant they were being more careful. The sound of tearing fabric, a grunt. "Is he okay?" Summer asked. "The bullet went through his thigh." "Whisper, they're out there." Grant inhaled and exhaled. "I'll be fine." His words came through clenched teeth. "Just don't let anybody through that door." Right. She could do that. But her hands trembled. Her gaze kept straying to the lifeless man in the doorway. "I've got your back." Grant's words were calmer this time, and quieter. "Breathe, Summer. You can do this." She did as he said, pulling deep breaths in and blowing them out slowly, trying to calm her racing heart. He'd trained her well, but she'd never called on the skills she needed today. She'd been a protector, keeping evil at bay. She'd never fired her weapon outside of training. She'd never killed a man. The body lying in a pool of blood proved that statement was no longer true. "Good," Grant said. "That should staunch the bleeding." "What are you doing?" Brian's whisper sounded indignant. "Help me up. I'm not fighting on my butt." Grant grunted as Brian helped him to his feet. "Stupid, stubborn bonehead." "Love you too, bro." Grant moved to stand in front of her. She shifted so he couldn't get by. "You're already injured. It's my turn." "No." He held her right arm and pulled her behind him. "You can call me a sexist pig later, but even with a bullet hole in my thigh, I'm better." He was right. And having somebody willingly step between her and danger, this was the kind of man she'd always hoped to find. Except now that Grant was there, she wished more than anything he weren't. She stayed where she was, between the two beds, slightly behind Grant, but still facing the doorway. Brian climbed over the twin and stood in the corner, where Bruno had been a few minutes before. "Move those bodies out of the way," Grant said. "I can help." Summer started to lean that direction, but Grant grabbed her arm and kept her behind him. "He's got it. I need your gun focused on that door." Despite Brian's lame leg, the man was strong. The room was tiny, so Brian hefted both bodies onto one of the beds. When he finished, he stood in the corner again, breathing heavily. "Thanks," Grant said. "No problem." They stood like that for another minute, 2 minutes. "Where are they?" Summer kept her voice low. Grant suddenly looked at the ceiling. She did as well, nothing there. "Hoping for angels?" His smile was more like a grimace. "There's a trapdoor in the master, just making sure." She'd have taken a trapdoor, another way off this death trap. "We're going to have to move." Grant kept his voice low enough that she could barely hear him. "Until we have control of this ship, we're still Ramon's captives." He snatched a pillow off the bed and tossed it through the door. A gunshot rent the silence. "That came from the top of the stairs," Brian said. "Thanks. It helps to know what angle we'll be murdered from." Grant actually chuckled. "We need to create a diversion." "Hold on," Brian said. "I'll grab my grenades." "Always with the sarcasm," Grant whispered. "Check the closet." Brian did, but Summer couldn't see past Grant to what he found. "Yes," Grant whispered. "Grab that other one, too." What were they doing? "Like that," Grant said. "A pillow?" The blankets on the bed beside her slid forward, along with the pillow. She had no idea what was going on. The sound of wheels moving across the hardwood had her glancing that way. Brian had found a tall rolling suitcase, shoved a duffel on top of it, and tied it to the extended handle of the luggage with a pillowcase. He draped the whole thing with one of the comforters. The invention was nearly as tall as she was. "I'll push it out, go low, and fire up the stairs." Grant's voice was barely discernible above the engine noise. "Summer, stay behind me. Aim down the stairs to the right. Brian, there's a door beside this one on the left. Both of you, get as low as you can and don't stand up. Stay in this room except to aim and fire. When you've taken out all the bad guys in your line of vision, say clear. Got it? Stay low, shoot bad guys." Brian's words were flippant, but his tone was anything but. "Clear." "Ready?" Grant asked. "Ready," Brian said. She squeezed Grant's arm and breathed a prayer for their safety. "Ready." They crept forward. Grant took a long, slow breath, and Summer did the same, blowing out as he did, remembering everything he'd taught her, remembering what she'd learned about God. Worst case scenario, they'd go home to be with him. Not what she wanted, yet. But if this was the end, she really didn't want it to be the end. She prayed hard. Grant pushed the rolling suitcase-turned decoy into the hallway and dove behind it. Bullets rained all around. Summer crouched, aimed to her right and down. Nobody there. "Clear!" Brian shouted. "Clear!" Grant said. Thank God they were both all right. "Be ready!" Grant barked the command. "Eyes open!" Summer's gaze flicked from the empty staircase leading down to the one leading up. But nobody else came into view. She, Brian, and Grant had killed. She counted 4 men so far. How many had Grant taken out in his bid to rescue them? Suddenly, the engine cut off. She'd become accustomed to its low hum. Now there was only silence. Silence like she'd never experienced before. No trees swaying in the breeze, no birds chirping, no cars passing, just the sounds of their breathing and the distant splash of water against the hull. The yacht slowed and swayed in the waves, creaked like an old house in a storm. She was afraid to move, afraid of the oppressive silence. Maybe there were more men on board. Maybe only Rahman was left, having allowed his men, once again, to die for him, which would make it 3 against 1. She should have been encouraged by the odds, but blood dripped past the wrappings on Grant's leg, glimmering red against the black wetsuit. Brian was struggling to stand, much less walk, and they were about to face Rahman, a man who'd proved he'd sink to any low to save himself. And he knew they were coming. Chapter 38. Push this down. The strain and pain in Grant's voice sent Summer's already pounding heart zooming as she shoved the luggage-turned decoy down the stairs. It clattered through the door and into the master bedroom. If someone came through the trapdoor, he'd have to contend with that before he could creep up behind them. She turned back to Grant, who looked up at the short flight of stairs as if he faced Everest. Brian was crouched beside him, messing with the wrappings on his makeshift bandage. "We need to wrap that wound." "After." The single word came through clenched teeth. Grant was not okay. And by the way Brian stood, slowly, testing his weight on his bad leg, he wasn't okay either. Summer had dragged them both into this, and only she remained uninjured. Grant tried to take a step up, stumbled and fell on the stairs. "Brian, help me." "No, wait," Summer said. "Let me—" But Brian, ignoring them both, crept up the stairs. A body was lying at the top, shot by Grant, she thought. Brian peeked over it into the galley kitchen. "Wait!" Summer said. A gunshot sounded an instant after Brian ducked again. "One guy," he whispered to his brother, "on the couch straight ahead." "Don't do that again!" Grant's words hummed with fury. "Stay here with her." He gripped the railing as if to haul himself to the first step. Summer stopped him with a hand on his free arm. "Please," she whispered. "It's my turn." "I got it." But his face was white. He was losing blood fast. She looked past Grant to Brian. "We'll climb together. You stay in the stairwell. When I say now, provide cover. I want you out of his sight, but make a lot of noise." "No." Ignoring Grant's protest, she pictured the kitchen as she'd seen it when she walked through earlier. Long and skinny, but there was a small peninsula of cabinets that jutted out from the side. She'd need to get behind it. "I'm going to take the shooter out." "Got it." "Summer!" Grant gripped her arm tight. "Do not go up there." "I'm not going to let you die for me today, Grant. Not if I can help it." At his wide eyes, she added, "I'm not dying either." She kissed his forehead, ignoring the terror that bubbled up inside her, and twisted out of his grip. "Brian, help me out!" She aimed up the stairs, hoping the thug would be dumb enough to approach. Behind her, Brian said, "We got this." When she heard nothing, she glanced back. Grant looked as if he wanted to fight. "Wait!" At the agony in his voice, she looked his way again. He rested his hand on her arm and closed his eyes. "Please, please, keep them safe." "Amen. Come on." Brian situated Grant at the bottom of the stairs, where he could defend himself if necessary. "Get me a pillow," Grant said. After Brian delivered the items, he crept up beside Summer, and they took cover behind the body. She decided not to think about that. "Ready?" she asked. At his grim nod, she took a deep breath, blew it out, and said, "Now!" Brian fired up and straight ahead. She launched herself over the dead man and into the kitchen, where she dove behind the short counter. She peeked, praying the guy on the couch hadn't seen her. He was lying on a sofa perpendicular to the stairs, taking cover behind its arm, hidden from the stairwell but not from her. She fired through the end of the sofa, heard a yelp of pain. Her gaze and aim swiveled around the space, not that there were many hiding places. Nobody jumped out at her, nobody fired. She grabbed a bottle from the dirty countertop and came at the love seat from behind. Aiming at the bit of skull she could see, she said, "Drop your gun, now!" The gun fell on the floor at his side. "Hands up!" One came up, supported by the other. Both were bloody. She crept closer and leaned over. Her bullet had gone through the fleshy part of his right shoulder. He was injured, but still alive. Still a threat. She didn't want to kill him, or take the time to tie him up, or worry about him. "Who else is here?" He responded with a string of slurred Spanish words. She picked up none of them. Rather than waste more time, she whacked him in the head with the bottle. He slumped. His eyes closed. Praying he'd stay unconscious, she grabbed his weapon and wiped the blood off of it with her shirt. 5 bullets in his, 7 in hers. Should be enough. Behind her, Brian limped forward. "Okay, same thing," she said. "Fire to give me cover." One weapon shoved in the waist at her back, the other prepared to shoot. She dashed up the stairs to the deck. She was itching to move, adrenaline coursing through her veins. But Brian was slower to get into position. He said, "Now!" At the sound of his gunshots, she hopped over the half wall that lined the stairwell. No return fire came. The yacht was dead in the water, tossed by the ocean's waves. More stars than Summer had ever seen dotted the midnight sky. She gazed out to sea, praying she'd catch sight of something. Approaching boats, a lighthouse. But there was nothing, nothing but blackness for as far as she could see. The sight was terrifying. She looked away quickly. Lord, I need courage, because the only thing scarier than that big, cold ocean was the man who'd brought her here. Ignoring the bitter wind, she peeked up toward the cockpit. No sign of Ramon. Maybe he was hiding. But where? Creeping toward the edge of the boat, squelching anxiety that urged her away from danger, she leaned out and looked toward the bow. Nothing in her line of sight, but that didn't mean he wasn't there. "Coming up," Brian said. She prepared to lay down cover fire, but there was no movement. The deck seemed deserted. Brian made it up and around the half wall, and she crouched beside him. "Any sign of him?" His words were nearly lost in the wind. "None. I'm going up. Watch my back." "Let me go. I'm faster and better trained. You stay here and cover me." She didn't wait for an answer, just dashed toward the staircase that led up one more flight, grabbing a cushion off the outside sofa. She tossed it up the stairs. A bullet shot clean through it. Ramon was waiting for her. What should I do? What would Grant do? She didn't have any idea. What she knew was that if they didn't get into that cockpit, they wouldn't be able to turn this boat back toward Maine. Grant was right. As long as Ramon had control of the helm, they were still his captives. Maybe somebody would come to rescue them. Or maybe someone would come to rescue Ramon. That couldn't happen, or she'd never be free. Meanwhile, Grant was bleeding. If that wound wasn't tended soon, he'd bleed to death. They were in the middle of a great big ocean. Nobody was going to find them. She had no choice. No choice! She had to go up there. Maybe she could take Ramon out and keep herself alive. Maybe not. But if she could incapacitate him, then Grant and Brian could make it back to shore. They could be saved, even if she couldn't. She really, really didn't want to die. But if she didn't act, Grant definitely would. Lord, help me. Tell me what to do. And then, the pop, pop, pop of gunshots. but they weren't coming toward her. Taking the risk, she scrambled up the stairs. Ramon was firing toward his own feet. What in the trap door? Ramon saw her coming and shifted his aim. She fired at him, diving toward the outside half wall of the cockpit as bullets flew over her head. Beneath her, glass littered the space. From below, Brian stomped his feet and yelled, "Cockpit!" She had no idea why and didn't bother to figure it out as she heard the distinctive click of an empty chamber. Ramon's gun was empty? Inexplicably, he laughed. "Where are your protectors?" Was he reloading or out of bullets? Was it a trick? Summer crouched, dashed across the doorway to the opposite side to get a look at him, waiting for gunshots. But none came. He was unarmed. She thought so, anyway. But she wasn't stupid. She stayed crouched behind the wall, but aimed toward Ramon, making herself as small a target as possible. "Put down your gun!" He was seated in the swivel captain's chair, the picture of relaxation, the gun in his hand. "I don't think I will. Drop your weapon and lie down on your belly." Another laugh. "You will have to shoot me. I don't believe you have it in you." She could shoot him. Maybe she should, for Grant's sake. He must have gone into the bedroom and fired up at the trap door. How much blood had he lost doing that? Ramon planned to murder Grant and Brian and sell her. She wanted to shoot him, but shooting somebody who was actively trying to kill her was one thing. Firing on a man who wasn't firing back, no matter what he'd done, was something else entirely. So, she couldn't do it. "Don't tempt me. I've already killed one of your men tonight, maybe more." "Sure, you did." His voice was laced with sarcasm. "You think, when you were in my sister's hospital room, that I didn't notice you? I noticed you. A beautiful woman. What man wouldn't? But I dismissed you as irrelevant, because you are no threat to me. You've gotten lucky, getting this close, thanks to all the help you've been given. But you're just a model. You're not going to kill me. You're just a pretty girl. A pretty girl who isn't capable of protecting herself, much less anybody else. You're only capable when there are men around to do the hard work. Like now. The only reason you've gotten as close as you have is because your friend created a diversion. You are no match for me." She was reminded of what her father used to shout at her when she was a child. A useless, disobedient brat. She hadn't cared about her father's opinion of her, and she didn't care about this man's. She knew who she was, always had. "Drop your gun and get down on the floor." He tossed the gun away. "It's empty anyway." He leaned forward to push himself to his feet. An instant before he looked away, she saw a gleam in his eyes. One hand slipped behind him and came back with something shiny and black. She fired. He collapsed like a stone, crumpled on the cockpit floor. The sound of the wind, the gentle splashing of the waves against the hull. It all faded. The whole world went quiet. She stood from behind the protective wall, stepped into the cockpit, crunching over broken glass, and stared down at her enemy, waiting for him to get up, to fight. But he didn't move.
Chapter 39. Grant had stopped Brian an instant before he'd followed Summer upstairs. "You let me know when she goes into the cockpit. I think I can help. I'll stomp hard when she's on her way, or just yell really loud. That should do it." Everything was so quiet he could easily hear Summer's footsteps. "Stay alive, and keep her alive." After Brian followed Summer, Grant had wrapped his wounds again, more tightly than before, trying to stanch the bleeding. He'd felt weak and woozy, but as long as there was still blood in his veins, he had to try to help. He'd made his way down the short stairway to the master, pushing the decoy suitcases out of the way. He'd climbed onto the bed and pushed himself against the headboard. And then he'd waited. There'd been more gunshots from the deck. After that, the silence seemed to stretch forever. Then another gunshot. It had come from a different place. Summer and Brian nearing the cockpit. Grant had heard nothing from Brian. He trusted that his brother would warn him if either of them had breached the little room right above him. Unless Brian couldn't warn him. This would be risky, but if Ramon was at the helm, then Grant could help. Had to help. The quiet was disconcerting. Nobody was moving. Finally, he'd thought it was time. Wasn't it? He'd prayed it would help. And then he'd fired up through the trap door toward where he thought the man should be standing, then rolled off the bed. Ramon returned fire. Grant crawled to the doorway as bullets buried themselves in the mattress, and then stopped. In the silence, he'd heard stomping, then cockpit, from his brother. Thank God. Had Grant injured or killed Ramon, or at least slowed him down? Were Summer and Brian safe? It was torture not knowing. The bleeding was under control for now. He'd made it up the first flight of stairs and seen the unconscious man on the couch. It was Gale, the one Grant had attacked after he'd escaped the closet. Summer must have clocked him good. The man's head was going to pound, but at least he was alive. Maybe he'd appreciate that when he went back to prison. Grant was halfway up the stairs leading to the deck when he heard another gunshot. He hurried up the last couple of steps looking for shooters, but it seemed everybody was down. Over here! Brian was near the steps to the cockpit but stopped as Grant hobbled that way. Together they made it to the top, where Summer still held the gun, aimed at Ramon as if waiting for him to come around. Blood spread beneath him. The man wouldn't be threatening her or anybody ever again. Brian scooted past them and went to the helm. The man who'd been driving the boat earlier, the man whom Grant had found and rendered unconscious, was lying on one of the benches. Dead. Had Ramon shot him? Payback for having been bested by Grant, he guessed. Grant touched Summer's shoulder. You all right? She looked up at him, blinking. I shot him. Ramon still held a gun in one hand. Another rested a few feet away. Grant kicked them both away, but Ramon was dead. It's okay, sweetheart. He took the gun from her hand and pulled her close. She wrapped her arms around him and held on tightly. They stood like that a long moment, and then she seemed to shake herself out of shock. You need to sit. His leg was throbbing. The world felt wobbly, and not just because they were bobbing in the ocean waves. I wouldn't turn down a comfortable recliner. She urged him onto a bench. This'll have to do. Lie down. He did, though it wasn't the most comfortable seat in the house. She lifted his leg and he clenched his teeth against the groan that wanted to escape. She disappeared for a second, then returned and shoved a pillow beneath his knee. It's still bleeding. Lie still. As his adrenaline drained, nausea rolled over him. He managed a nod. Summer disappeared from his view, and Grant closed his eyes and listened while Brian contacted the authorities, then started the engine and gunned it. They're coming, Brian said. I'm moving to intercept. Great. He couldn't get any volume and doubted Brian heard him. A moment later, a blanket was draped over him. He tried to pry his eyes open, but couldn't seem to manage it. It's okay. Summer's soft voice spoke in his ear as she wrapped his hand in her own. Just rest. We'll get you to the hospital. He wanted to answer, to thank her for the blanket, to tell her he loved her, but he couldn't do anything but lie there and enjoy the feel of her skin against his. And thank God they'd survived.
Chapter 40. After Grant was taken by the ambulance to the hospital, Summer and Brian were separated and interviewed by local authorities and state police. Now Summer was enduring round 3, this with a couple of irritated feds from the Drug Enforcement Agency. Summer, Grant, and Brian had survived being kidnapped and held on a yacht filled with armed men, and everybody wanted to know how. The answer was lying in a hospital with a bullet hole in his thigh. Gale of the chin curtain beard was recovering from his wounds in the same hospital. Ramon and most of the other men on the yacht were dead. Summer had killed 2, Brian 1, and Grant 1. The driver of the boat had been fatally shot, probably by Ramon in a fit of anger, though the police were convinced Grant had done it. They'd run ballistics and figure it out. One thug had been found, alive, floating in the dinghy. Other bodies had washed up on shore. She couldn't account for them, but figured Grant probably could. He'd rescued Misty. That couldn't have been easy. There was so much Summer still didn't know. The police had assured her that Misty was all right, but Summer needed to see her, to hug her. She needed to check on Grant. And she needed to make sure Hughes and the rest of the team were all right. But she hadn't been able to do any of those things. She'd done nothing but endure questioning in the hours since she'd planted her feet on solid ground. Tell me again how you knew the drugs would be offloaded at that property. The female DEA agent was skinny and had a stark bun so tight it made her squint. Her partner, a younger blonde man with eager eyes, reminded Summer of a puppy eyeing a treat just out of reach. She'd already forgotten both of their names. In her defense, it had been a very long day. "I already told you that." Summer stifled a yawn. They were seated in an interrogation room at the local police station. It wasn't the kind you saw on TV. No two-way mirror, and old scuffed table. It was small and windowless and cold. A camera was mounted in the corner. "Are we boring you?" the woman asked. "I've told you everything I know." "It's a simple question, Ms. Lake. How did you know?" The door banged open, and an overweight gray-haired man stormed in carrying a black briefcase. "Galinsky, FBI." He announced himself to the room, then approached the table. "Summer Lake." The DEA agent shot to her feet. "You can't just barge in here." "Sit down, Agent Perry, or take it up with your boss." Galinsky barely spared the woman a glance as she clamped her lips shut and sat. To Summer, he said, "Sorry for the delay. I've spent most of the night piecing things together." She stood and shook his hand. "I'm glad you're here." She'd called him from a cell phone they'd found on the yacht, and he'd promised to do what he could. Summer had expected him to make some phone calls on their behalf, not drive to Portland. Brian followed Galinsky inside. She hadn't seen him since they'd both been checked out by paramedics, and then ushered into separate police cruisers. He looked ragged as he limped inside, but he brightened when he saw her. "You okay?" She smiled at him. "Happy to see you." She shifted her focus to Galinsky. "We couldn't have done any of this without Brian." Brian grunted, as if he disagreed as he sat beside her. "Have you heard anything about Grant?" Summer asked. "They won't tell me." "Hospital says he's fine." Galinsky lowered his substantial girth into a chair at the end of the table. "They cleaned and closed the wounds. They're hoping to avoid a transfusion." "I called his room, and his brother answered." Galinsky's gaze slid to Brian. "Sam?" "I bet they're all there," Brian said. "I'm glad he's not alone." "Apparently," Galinsky said, "every time his eyes open, he asks after you two." "We'll go over as soon as we're done here," Summer said. "My sister?" "Ms. Lake is at the hospital." Summer sucked in a breath, but Galinsky hurried to add, "Waiting for you." She was examined and released. "You talked to her?" "Briefly. Physically, she's fine, just frantic to make sure you're all right. She was going to come here, but I told her I'd take you over there as soon as I could." Agent Perry cleared her throat. "If you three are finished catching up, we're trying to get some answers." "That's why I'm here." Galinsky plopped his briefcase on the table. "I'm sure Ms. Lake has told you everything already, and I can corroborate." Galinsky explained that the DEA had been informed of the possible drug smuggling operation and had decided not to intervene. While he talked, he opened his briefcase and pulled out page after page of records, explaining everything that had happened from the attack in the parking garage almost a week before to that moment, and every effort on his part and theirs to get them involved. The interview became much less contentious at that point. By the time Summer and Brian followed Agent Galinsky outside, the sun was brightening the eastern sky. A light breeze held the scent of springtime and hope. For such a large man, Galinsky moved fast, much faster than Brian could. He probably had no idea they trailed so far behind. It felt like a month had passed since she'd told Grant she had feelings for him, not 24 hours. Amazing what could change in a day. One thing that hadn't changed was her affection for him. Or, if it had changed, it had only grown. Because her fears were based on the false belief that depending on others would only lead to abandonment and disappointment. She'd been protecting those beliefs like a cherished pet. But now she knew they were nothing but lies that had kept her alone and lonely. She'd tried to pretend she didn't need anybody. How foolish. How ridiculous. She didn't just need people in her life. She wanted people in her life. Not just any people either. Brian limped beside her. At some point in the last few hours, somebody had found him a cane. Even with it to lean on, he was moving more slowly than he had before. "Does it hurt?" He shrugged. "It'll be all right." Brian would never replace John, the closest thing she'd ever had to a brother, but she could imagine a bond building between them, between her and all of Grant's family. The thought of it made her heart thump with anticipation. Family. How she'd always secretly longed for a real family, a happy family, like John's and Grant's. She wanted that, needed it, wished she had it with her own sisters. Summer grabbed Brian's free hand. "This is probably a lousy thing to say, but I'm glad you were there last night. I'm sorry about your leg, and about all the horror of it." She didn't know how to sum up what they'd endured. The terror, the trauma of shooting people, killing people. "It was awful, but I couldn't have survived it without you. I wish I'd done more. I wish I'd kept us from getting captured. You helped get all three of us free, but it was more than that. If I'd been alone, if you hadn't come, I can't think how I would have handled it. Having you there made me want to fight." Brian halted and turned to face her, yanking his hand away. "Are you in love with my brother?" The sudden shift took her by surprise. She stopped and was formulating a reply when he continued. "You told him you loved him, but emotions were running high. He thought it too, right? He was planning to sacrifice himself to protect us. If the boat hadn't turned abruptly, Grant would be dead. One more thing in a whole list of things to be thankful for. Is that why you said you loved him?" Brian stepped closer, gaze flicking from one eye to the other, as if trying to read the truth there. "Do you really care for him? Because if you don't—" "I really care for him." Brian didn't move, just watched her, eyebrows lifted. "I'm in love with him, Brian. I'm new at this. I've never even had a serious boyfriend." The word felt weird in her mouth. "But I'll do everything in my power not to hurt him." It was a long, tense moment before Brian nodded. "Good. Because Grant is head over heels for you. You have the power to make him happy, or rip his heart out." He started walking again. Up ahead, Galinsky stood beside a dark sedan, wearing an expression that told her he felt impatient but was trying to hide it. "I had that kind of power over Grant for a long time." Brian didn't look at her as he spoke. "And I exploited it. And hurt him. Now I'll do anything to keep him from being hurt. So just don't be fooled. His body is tough, but inside, he's anything but." Summer didn't plan to hurt Grant, but she wasn't always careful with people's feelings, focused more on actions than sentiments. "Help me to be kind, Lord. Show me how to love him." Because she did love Grant, but not like he loved her, not yet. Maybe that was the kind of prayer God answered. Come to think of it, knowing what she knew about God, she figured it was exactly the kind of prayer he answered. She sat in the front seat beside Galinsky as he navigated out of the parking lot, turning away from the bright sunshine peeking over the eastern horizon. "How did Ramon get there? I thought you guys had him under surveillance." "They were surveilling the hotel lobby. He must have gone out a side door." "He knew they were there." "Evidently. What happened on shore last night? We missed everything." "Talk to Hughes. Your friends took up positions all around the property. They blocked the road, keeping the van and all the smugglers there until the police showed up. They'd lost touch with you three. One of them searched the land on the south edge of the inlet looking for you and found Misty instead. I can't believe Ramon dragged my sister into this." She'd worried about her sisters, but she hadn't really believed Ramon would find them, much less get to them. "Do you know when she was taken?" "Yesterday afternoon," he said. "When you called, they forced her to lie to you." Summer should have considered that. She should have had some kind of panic word. She'd know for next time. Lord, let there never be a next time. "We're still investigating Ramon and his operation," Galinsky said. "I'm thinking he must have greased some palms somewhere to figure out as much as he did. About you and your family, your cousin, and where he lives. Not sure we'll ever get to the bottom of that. What I want to know is, was his sister involved?" "I believe Maritza Hidalgo is innocent. Ramon told us that on the boat last night." She glanced behind her at Brian, thinking he might add something, but his eyes were closed, his head resting against the back of the seat. And her husband doesn't know anything either. If he was telling the truth. He thought he'd won, Summer said. I don't know why he'd lie to us. Galinsky wagged his head back and forth. Okay, we'll keep that in mind. Galinsky turned into the hospital's drive and pulled over at the main entrance. I'm headed to the FBI field office. Call if you need me, otherwise I'll be in touch. Thank you for intervening and for everything you did. The man's smile bunched his pudgy cheeks. Glad you got a happy ending. You sure earned it. After Galinsky drove away, Summer preceded Brian through the glass doors. This small hospital was nothing like Mass General, where she'd been guarding the Hidalgo family. But still, surfaces gleamed. The air held the faint scent of disinfectant, and men and women in scrubs bustled from place to place. It brought back memories of the days she'd spent there. She was scanning the lobby for a desk where they could find out Grant's room number when a blur hurtled toward her and crashed into her. Misty wrapped her in a hug. Thank God. Thank God. When I saw you in that dinghy. Her voice was awash in tears. She clung to Summer like she hadn't since they were children. It was the scariest thing, getting kidnapped, all alone without you beside me this time. And then getting shoved on that yacht. I thought, I don't know, that they'd take me back to Mexico, that I'd end up like before. But then Grant, the same soldier as before. And I know you work with him, but still, bizarre that he was my rescuer again. He showed up in a wetsuit, all sleek and gorgeous, and got us out of there. From far away, a chair scraped roughly against the linoleum floor, and a man approached, then stopped a few feet away. 6 feet, sandy blonde hair that curled at his nape, hazel eyes focused on Misty. Whoever he was handsome. Was this a boyfriend? Misty kept talking. But nothing was scarier than when I saw you in that dinghy, headed toward the yacht we'd barely escaped. I was so cold I couldn't even speak, but Grant just shoved a gun in my hand and dove back in. It was the craziest thing I've ever witnessed. I could barely see him in the black water, and then he was at the boat. You guys were already on, but he just took out the dinghy driver. Let the little boat go, and then hung from the rails. The boat was headed out to sea, and there he was, clinging to the side like Spider-Man. I've never prayed so hard in my life. It was nuts. I was so scared I'd never see any of you again. Her sister hadn't said so many words to her since she was in elementary school, back when Misty used to follow Summer around like a shadow, back when she thought Summer hung the moon, before she became an angry teenager, and then a haughty model, and then a damaged survivor. This was the Misty Summer had spent her childhood trying to protect. Sorry. Misty stepped away, wiping her eyes. I'm just happy to see you. Summer pulled her in again. Don't apologize to me. I'm the one who got you dragged into this. I never meant... It's over though, right? Misty backed away to see Summer's face. She wore hospital scrubs and a sweatshirt that swallowed her. She had on bright pink sneakers that, Summer knew, couldn't belong to her stylish little sister. But her skin was clear, her eyes bright. Her blonde hair was tangled and windblown. She looked healthy and whole and perfect. You're okay? Summer asked. They didn't hurt me. It was always about stopping you and Grant. It was the same guy who kidnapped us in Mexico, right? His name was Vasco Ramon. Was? Oh. Misty hugged her again. Thank God you're all right. Summer! She stepped back at the name, shocked to see her older sister running her way. You're here. Thank God. Misty gave her an apologetic look. I should have warned. Oh my gosh. Crystal wrapped both Summer and Misty close. The oldest sister was the shortest at only 5'7", taking after their dad. She carried more weight than her little sisters, especially after 3 kids, but that only made her more formidable. Summer couldn't remember the last time the 3 of them had been together. It had been years, and they'd never done the group hug thing. When Crystal backed away, she wiped tears. This is absolutely ridiculous. Can't you get a real job, one where you're not constantly in danger? Before Summer could answer, Crystal looked at their younger sister and snapped, And you! The next time Summer offers you protection, you take it! The stranger behind Misty smiled, though he hid the expression quickly. But Crystal barreled on. Both of you out fighting bad guys. Gonna give me a heart attack. It's time for it to stop. Crystal looked stern and angry, glaring at them in turn. I'm serious. Summer cracked up. I don't think you have that kind of authority over us. Crystal planted her hands on her hips, the anger in her expression softened by tears dripping off her chin. Well, I should. Normal people don't tangle with drug smugglers and kidnappers. Summer caught sight of Brian hovering beside the sandy-haired stranger. You can lecture us later. I need to see Grant. We're coming with you. Misty slipped her hand into Summer's. Crystal took the other. Brian headed toward the elevator, and they walked behind him. The other man followed. He was straight-backed, and though he was dressed casually, jeans and a long-sleeved polo, the clothes were crisp and expensive-looking. They were waiting for the elevator when Summer turned to figure out why he was there. Before she said a word, Misty said, Oh, sorry. Summer, this is Tate Steele. He's a colleague, works in my office. Tate smiled and stuck out his hand to her. Nice to meet you, Summer. She shook Tate's hand. Glad you're here. It was nice to think Misty had a friend who cared enough to drive to Maine to check on her, though Misty had called him a colleague. Interesting. In the elevator, she introduced Brian to her sisters, and Tate, who barely spoke, but somehow seemed to dominate the small space. A couple of nurses looked up as they passed the nurses' station on Grant's floor, barely acknowledging them. Finally, Summer knocked on the wide hospital room door and stepped in. She'd barely gotten 2 feet when she was enveloped in a soft hug. Peggy said, We were so worried. Summer was passed from Peggy to Roger, then Sam, Michael, and Derek. Finally, she pushed past the group, leaving them to pepper Brian with questions. Grant was lying on the hospital bed, pale but awake. When she approached, the crease between his eyebrows smoothed. Hey! Hey! She leaned down and kissed his cheek, ignoring the conversations behind her. How are you? Ready to go home. They're not letting you leave today? Surely after a gunshot wound. No, I'm stuck here at least overnight. He glared at the IV bag beside his bed. Antibiotics and fluids. Why they can't give me a bottle of water and a prescription. The room was packed with people. The ledge near the window littered with cups of coffee, some empty, some nearly full. Not to mention food wrappers, a giant purse that had to belong to Peggy, and a duffel bag with clothes spilling out. The Wright family knew how to fill a space. Were you questioned all night? Grant asked. We'd still be there if not for Agent Galinsky. She gave him a quick rundown on what he'd missed. We've been asked to stay close until they wrap up their investigation. They came here and talked to me earlier, trying to figure out how the 4 of us managed to take down so many men. 4? Misty shot 2 of them. He looked past her. Summer tried to imagine her little sister shooting people, but the picture wouldn't come. Where is she? Grant asked. She was here earlier. She's waiting in the hall with Crystal. They were terrified for you. I was sort of out of it, but Crystal was so upset, Mom had to take her outside and calm her down. You met Crystal too? Of course. Mom's already adopted them both. Brian finally extricated himself from the rest of his family and stepped around to the other side of the bed. Glad you're okay. Grant gripped Brian's forearm. You risked your life to protect me. His gaze cut to Summer, before leveling it on Brian again. And the woman I love. I owe you everything. His voice cracked on the last word. Brian's Adam's apple bobbed. I thought we were past that, owing each other, paying each other back. Yeah, well, just when I thought we were even, I'm in debt again. You're not. But if you insist, Red Sox tickets, first base line, and we'll call it even. Done. Peggy had been watching the exchange, but when Grant yawned, her soft expression hardened. Okay, everyone, out. Grant needs his sleep. Summer started to obey, but he caught her hand. Stay. I don't want to get in trouble. She glanced at the older woman, but Peggy just winked as she kissed her son on the forehead. We're going to let you rest, but we'll be close. One of your brothers ordered takeout to be delivered to the waiting room. She rolled her eyes. They're probably going to kick us out of here. After a squeeze of Grant's shoulder, she backed away. Call if you need us. Peggy ushered the rest of her family out the door. When the room was quiet, Summer turned back to Grant. He squinted. How are you really? You're the one who got shot. All those men, Summer, all those bullets. She knew what he was asking, picturing the bodies of the two she'd killed. I'll get over it. She hoped, anyway. I'm not sure you ever get over taking a life. Even in self-defense. Even when you have no choice. You just learn to live with it. Have you? I've learned to trust God with it. Ultimately, He's the one in control. He holds every life in His hands. Grant pushed a button, raising the head of his bed. Don't sit up. You need to. I'm fine. You're as bad as my mother. But he softened the words with a smile. Are you and I would understand if you wanted to take back what you said last night. And yesterday. I mean, if you're having second. She cut him off with a kiss, felt his smile beneath her lips. His leg might be injured, but there was nothing wrong with the arms that wrapped around her and pulled her closer. The door opened and slammed, and a throat cleared. Do you mind? Summer recognized the voice and backed away. Ever heard of knocking? Grant asked. Summer sighed before turning. You're late. John crossed the room and enveloped her in a hug. I'm sorry I wasn't here. I took the red eye, but... We had it under control, Grant said. Oh yeah, I can see that. Heavy on the sarcasm, John held Summer at arm's length. Are you okay? Injured? Ticked at me? Yes, no, and no. I should have been here. How's Denise? Summer was pretty sure a smile lurked beneath the concerned expression. Perfect. Charming the Wrights in the waiting room as we speak. She's here? Of course she's here. My favorite cousin could have been killed, no thanks to this idiot. He turned to Grant. The bullet, through and through? Child's play. Grant was amazing, Summer said. I'd be halfway to Mexico if not for him. John and Grant looked at each other a long time, all amusement gone. As a fellow Green Beret, John probably understood what Grant had done better than Summer ever would. All the risks he'd taken. All the men he'd incapacitated or killed. You'll tell me everything later. Grant just nodded. John shifted his gaze to Summer. And you two? Summer opened her mouth to speak, but Grant beat her to it. You have a problem with that? John smiled and punched his shoulder. Took you long enough. She wasn't sorry to see the smile on her cousin's face. He approved. Of course he approved. Grant was his best friend. I've been waiting for Summer. Grant winked at her when he said it. She's a hard sell. The words finished with a yawn. I'm sure I've gone over my 1 minute allotted time, John said. I can picture your mom pacing outside with a stopwatch. Just needed to put eyes on you. Your family tells me you'll need to stay with someone for a few weeks. When I mentioned that my place was available, Brian bit my head off. I guess he thinks you're staying with him. But if that doesn't work out, you know you're welcome in Coventry. I think I'll take Brian up on his offer, for now anyway. He and I have some time to make up. Glad things are better there. John turned to Summer. We should let him rest. And by the looks of you, you could use some sleep as well. She plopped down on the chair and took Grant's hand. I'll be here. John nodded once. Denise is looking to rent some rooms nearby for the family, so we won't be going anywhere. She's already contacted our church. By noon, the whole town of Coventry will know everything and be praying for you. Grant grinned at that. You've become quite the small-town guy. I'll take that as a compliment. You should give it a try. Grant glanced at Summer. We'll see. After John walked out, Summer lowered the head of Grant's bed and pulled the blankets up over him. That good? I never pegged you for a caregiver. I can learn. He squeezed her hand. You'll be here when I wake up. I'm not going anywhere. His eyes drifted shut, and she sat back in the chair and let her own eyes close. She needed rest, and she needed to stay with Grant, not just today, but forever. Chapter 41. It took days for Summer to piece together the entire story of what had happened that horrible night. To discover how many of Ramon's men had died for him, how many had ended up in jail. At least the man hadn't been smuggling people. But fentanyl, 200 pounds of it, nearly $3 million worth, all seized by the DEA. Richard Bannister's properties had been searched. The small artifact Summer had seen Ramon pass to him in the parking garage was found at his home in Durham. She hadn't been able to identify Bannister, having never seen his face, but she'd gotten a good look at the little gold statue. Bannister had confessed to giving Ramon access to the seaside property, claiming that he thought Ramon was smuggling more pre-Columbian antiquities into the country. He'd sworn he had no idea the man was a drug smuggler. He was in jail awaiting trial. It was a month before Summer's nightmares lessened, and she started getting full nights of sleep again. She'd been on administrative leave from work, and though she could have returned any time, she'd opted instead to stay with Denise in Coventry. She'd have stayed with her cousin, but after a week at Brian's, Grant had opted to move in with John to finish his recovery. Apparently, Brian had been too easy on him. John was happy to play the role of commanding officer again, whipping Grant back into shape at the gym in town. Meanwhile, as Summer spent time with Denise, she remembered things she'd once loved, back before the kidnapping, like fashion and art and beauty. Things she'd discarded as irrelevant in her bid to be tough, to never be vulnerable, to never need anybody. She needed to fight the lie she'd been telling herself for years, that she could take care of herself. All humans needed each other. If anything, Summer was needier than most. She'd known Denise was a nice person, but after a couple of weeks of living in her guest house, Summer understood why John had fallen in love with her. There was something special about the movie star and her sweet little daughter, Ella, who'd wormed her way into Summer's heart when she'd helped protect her the previous winter. Summer spent most of her days with Denise and sometimes Ella, while Grant focused on physical therapy. But every night, Summer and Grant ate dinner, talked, laughed. They shared their dreams and their fears. They held hands and kissed and took walks, and when Grant was able, went on hikes around Coventry. They attended John's church and got to know the community. John wasn't wrong. There was something amazing about small-town life, something that drew her. But she was part owner of a business in Boston. Grant wasn't going back. He'd already resigned from GBPS and had been offered multiple jobs, from private military contracting to law enforcement. He hadn't chosen a position yet, living off his savings and John's generosity, until he knew what he wanted to do next. Maybe waiting for her to decide what she wanted, which she was going to have to do soon. Bartlett had made it clear that she either needed to return to work or give him the go-ahead to hire someone to replace her. It seemed the business was going strong. Summer had worried that Maritza Hidalgo would badmouth the company after they took down her brother, but she'd done the opposite. Once she'd been released from the hospital to return to Mexico, she'd publicly thanked GBPS for their role in her protection and in bringing down a drug cartel, though she'd left out the fact that the cartel had been run by her own brother. Summer had been there when the authorities had given her the news. If there'd been any doubt of the Mexican governor's innocence, the way she'd nearly collapsed with shock and heartbreak had dispelled it. Summer felt for Señora Hidalgo, who was grieving both her brother's death and his duplicity. It was over. The only question was, what should Summer do now? She mulled over as she parked and headed toward the beach at Lake Ayesha. It was a perfect summer evening, the sun occasionally blocked by puffy clouds as it dipped toward the western horizon across the glassy lake. The temperature hovered in the low 80s. Children splashed in shallow water. Adults lounged on towels or chairs they'd hauled from their cars. A speedboat pulled tubes with riders on the far side of the lake, the low hum of its engine nearly drowned out by music and laughter. The town was gearing up for its annual Independence Day events, which would begin in a week. Summer and John had been in town the previous year, guards for Josie Harrington, soon to be Josie Wyndham. Coventry did the holiday up big. Of course, the longer she'd been there, the more she'd learned that Coventry did every holiday big. Today wasn't a holiday. though she prayed there'd be a celebration as she greeted people who'd become her friends. Reed, Ella's dad, stood beside James at the edge of the crowd. They gave Summer a nod as she walked by. Jackie held her newborn son, Ella's half-brother. Cassidy, Grace, and Aspen cooed over the baby. Tabby chased a 1-year-old toward the lake, but his daddy, Fitz, intercepted the little boy before he dove into the clear water. Braden and Andrew hauled a cooler from the parking lot, Carly following with a tray of something in one hand, the other gripping the fist of a toddler girl trying to escape. Josie's food truck was parked at the far end of the beach area. She'd be ready with dinner when the time came. Thomas was not far, chatting with people Summer had never seen before. The man knew everybody in town. A handful of guys from GBPS had come. Some of the younger ones were tossing a football, showing off for a group of college-aged girls reclining on the sand. Beyond them, older people chatted on the far side of the small beach, probably Denise's parents and their friends. Oh, and there were Aunt Sally and Uncle Marshall. Even John's sisters, Jocelyn and Jenny, had made the trip. Summer glanced at the water where her cousin's kids played. She was about to head toward her aunt and uncle when a shout had her turning. "Summer!" The call came from Misty, who was walking beside Crystal, crossing the grassy park that bordered the beach. Summer greeted them both with a kiss. "It'll mean a lot to John that you're here." Misty gazed around at the lake, the park, and the charming main street just across the road. "I can see why he likes it." "Yeah." Summer followed her sister's gaze. "Coventry's beautiful." "There you are!" John's voice was strained, almost angry, as he stomped across the park toward them. "Where have you been?" Grant walked beside John, his limp almost completely gone. He gave Summer an apologetic look, as if John's attitude were his fault. Summer made a show of glancing at the time on her phone. "We're all in place, 10 minutes early." "Yeah, well," John greeted Misty and Crystal with hugs. "Glad you two are here." Then he turned back to Summer. "You remember what to do?" "It's not that complicated. Garrett's already set up with the camera." She nodded to the man standing in the middle of the park, fiddling with camera equipment. "He'll record it. Aspen's going to take photos." John wrung his hands. "Okay. Okay. Sorry I'm being such a..." "You think it's okay? It's not. People in California do these things really big. What if she's expecting..." Summer wrapped her fingers around his thick forearm. "You've got this, John. All she wants is you." He pulled back, clearly too antsy to be still. "She'll be here any second. I'll be over there, trying not to..." He didn't finish the sentence, just jogged across the park to the picnic table about 100 yards away. He'd planned to drape it with a white cloth, thinking that would be enough. But their new friends hadn't been content with that. That morning, most of the women in their little group had gathered to string lights and rope from trees surrounding the table. They'd clipped photos of the couple on the rope, along with fresh flowers and greenery. Tabby's artistic side had come out as she'd ordered the rest of them around. She'd added a beautiful centerpiece of wildflowers. Somehow, she'd transformed the run-of-the-mill picnic table into a showpiece. Grant slipped his hand in Summer's, gazing past the trees to where John paced. "You think Denise is going to be surprised?" "She'll guess as soon as she sees. The surprise will be all of us." "You think she'll say yes?" "No doubt in my mind." Summer turned to Grant. "What?" "Just wondering what that would feel like, not to doubt. Obviously, John's terrified." "He's just nervous." Grant was quiet a long moment, standing beside her, their hands linked. 2 months ago, she would never have imagined falling in love with this man, being in a relationship with him, being one half of a couple. She certainly wouldn't have known how amazing it would be to have a man like Grant at her side, to know she was loved and cherished, to know somebody believed she was worth fighting for. Yet here she was with a man who'd somehow become the most important person in her entire world. She'd never dared to dream she could love somebody like she loved him. Never dared to dream somebody like him would ever love her. Denise's red Tesla whipped into a space near the ice cream shop. Summer turned to tell everybody to look away, look busy, but they'd all seen. The whole group suddenly seemed enthralled with the still lake. She and Grant slipped behind a tree to watch. Denise parked and headed for John, who was at the sidewalk by the time she crossed the street. Summer peered at Garrett and Aspen, who were peeking from behind trees, catching it all as John greeted his soon-to-be bride with a kiss. Most of their crowd were watching now, but Summer didn't bother to tell them to look away. Denise only had eyes for John. "Is this the kind of proposal you want?" Grant asked. Summer considered Grant's question. "I've never thought about it." "Are you thinking about it now?" She shrugged, suddenly shy, because she was imagining this scene differently. The man, not John, but Grant. The woman, not Denise, but herself. "A little, but—" "You're going back to Boston." He stated it like fact, as if there were no question. She didn't miss the flat tone when he added, "It's okay. I can take that job with—" "I don't think that's what I want." As she said it, she knew it was true. "I'm done carrying a gun for work. I'm done living in fear." Grant faced her, eyes wide. "Really?" "I don't have a plan. At all. You do whatever you want, and I'll just follow." Had she really said that? She'd let some guy dictate her life to her, like her mother had done? But Mom had made a crucial mistake. She'd trusted the wrong man. "Not that I expect you to." She didn't want him to get the wrong idea. "I have money, and I can sell my condo." He shut her up with a kiss, then pulled her into a hug. "I know we're not ready, but just so you know, I'd be honored to take care of you. And if you're serious, I have so many options, so many offers. But you want to know what I really want?" She pressed her ear against his chest, reveling in the sound of his heart beating, and watched as John led Denise to the picnic table. "Oh, here it goes." The sun was setting. The timing was perfect. Denise slowed, gazing up at John with wide eyes. She knew what was coming, and in some ways, so did Summer. "What I want," Grant said, "is you. And this." His words rumbled in his chest against her ear. "This town, this community, I'd like to stay right here." His words settled in her heart as she watched the scene. John and Denise reached the picnic table. John fell to one knee. Summer couldn't hear what he was saying, but it seemed he'd prepared quite a speech. Finally, he lifted a small box. Nodding, Denise held out her hand. John slipped the ring on her finger, and then she tugged him to his feet and threw herself into his arms. Summer couldn't help the tears that dripped down her cheeks. She'd never been a crier, or maybe she'd always just hidden that part of herself. She didn't need to hide anymore. Grant and Summer hurried across the park, the rest of John and Denise's friends and family joining them. John finally ended the kiss, and the crowd erupted in applause and cheers, and a couple of wolf whistles. Denise turned, shocked. Little Ella was the first to burst into the circle, hurrying to hug her mother. "I knew for a whole week, Mom. He asked me if it was okay, and of course I said yes. I knew you'd say yes." She continued to babble as the families and friends drew close, offering their congratulations. Grant and Summer hung back. They'd have their chance with the happy couple soon enough. From behind, Grant wrapped his arms around her and pulled her against his chest. "I see what you mean about this place, these people. This is pretty perfect." She laid her hands over his, reveling in their warmth, and watched the celebration. Knowing John and Denise would have a beautiful future here. She and Grant would too.
You've been listening to Courage in the Shadows, written by Robin Patchen, narrated by Brian and Matilda. Copyright 2023 by Robin Patchen. Audio copyright 2024 by Robin Patchen.